So I'm excited to introduce to you my good friend Philip Werner, who is the founder of sectionhiker.com. And he's going to talk to you today specifically about the philosophy of lightweight backpacking for scouts, and with heavy emphasis on the big three, which is the shelter, sleep system, and backpack.
Section hiking, just so you're aware of what this is what people do when they hike the Appalachian Trail bit by bit. I'm going to just talk to you a little bit about the philosophy and some of the major components in this presentation. The general idea is kind of a minimalist approach to backpacking, really where you're just using the lightest gear for your needs. You're leaving unnecessary items behind. Just to give you an example, you might leave multiple pairs of clothing behind. You're just, bringing the stuff you wear at night when you go to sleep, a sort of extra thermal layer, and the clothes on your back. And you can go for weeks like that. Just wash it in the stream. You don't have to bring extra stuff. Lightweight backpackers tend to hike longer distances. So instead of maybe 6 miles a day, you can go 10, 15, even 20 miles a day. You're really striving for simplicity. Going light is not just about gear reduction. It's about building skills and practicing those skills and becoming an advanced backpacker. Doing this without compromising safety. There's a real skill to making the judgments about what's safe and what's not safe. You're developing advanced backcountry skills. It's almost forcing you to go out without a net. Part of it's physical fitness. A lot of it's trip planning. I can't emphasize that enough. And that can inform what you actually carry in your pack. Navigation, nutrition. You can really lighten your pack by taking high-calorie food, for instance. Highly compressible food without a lot of packaging. Survival skills, really understanding how to stay warm and the relationship between movement and warmth. Weather forecasting, wilderness first aid. The thing that I like about lightweight backpacking is that I have to develop expertise in all these areas. Okay, just a little bit about degrees of lightweight. We have the sort of 40 to 50 pound pack. This is about 25% of your body weight. What we like to do as lightweight backpackers is get that gear weight down to 10 to 20 pounds, not including food and water, fuel, or your worn clothing. Before I went kind of more lightweight, I could hike at about 1 mile an hour. Now I hike at 2 miles an hour. Ultralight backpacking is considered 10 pounds or less. We're trying to get you into this space up here. When you're thinking about reducing your pack weight, there are easy things to reduce and harder things to reduce. They really consist of the shelter that you're using, sleeping system, and the backpack. Try to get those under 3 pounds each. That's a great start to going light. It gets a little bit harder when it comes to clothing. You can get rid of your unnecessary duplicate clothing. Water, filter stove, pots and mugs, you can incrementally reduce a couple ounces by replacing them with lighter alternatives, but it gets much harder. And then food and water, there are just effective limits to how light you can go. Generally, 1.75 pounds of food is about what you need. So how to lighten your gear. This is a 5-step process in getting people to reduce the weight of their gear. First, you got to weigh everything. You have to establish what your base weight is. The next thing I mentioned is reduce the big 3 to 9 pounds or less. You eliminate non-essentials. It's going to depend on every trip you go on. There's not going to be any such thing as a fixed gear list for the rest of your life. It's going to depend on the conditions, the time of year. We're going to encourage you to use multifunction gear. If you're setting up a tent, can you get a tent or a shelter where you use your hiking poles, your trekking poles, instead of bringing extra poles with you? The other thing you can do is augment the sleeping bag with a down jacket or an insulated coat. You get very creative at figuring out multiple ways to use your gear. And then this is really important, and that's reducing the size of the stuff that you carry. If you have more compact gear, you can take a smaller backpack. When I say weigh everything, here's just an example of a gear list I put together for a 200-mile, 2-week hike on the Appalachian Trail last April. This is literally everything I carried without my food. Once you get fanatical like this, you can stare at this list and say, that sleeping bag is heavy. Is there any way I can reduce that weight? Maybe use a quilt. What I'm going to do right now is just go through the big 3 and tell you a little bit about some of the options available. Double wall tent, hammocks, single wall tent, tarp tents, and tarps. What's called a double wall tent. It's got an inner tent and an outer fly. One of the disadvantages of it is it's heavy. They weigh 4, 5, 6, 7 pounds. They're heavy. There's another kind of shelter that some of us use, a hammock. It's a really interesting option, relatively heavy, but you can see how much lighter it is. One downside of a hammock, in my experience, is it's pretty bulky. It takes up a lot of space in a pack. Single wall tents, what's great about them is that they're lightweight, they're really fast to set up in the rain. Up, no problem. One of the disadvantages is poor ventilation. Still pretty heavy. So now we get into tents that are really designed for lightweight backpacking. They're basically single wall shelters, but if you look here, just between the fabric and the ground, there's some mesh there, and that helps with airflow. And they're pretty light. You can view a tarp tent as a floorless tarp, but a little bit friendlier. It's got a floor. It's got great ventilation. I used to pitch this with my hiking poles. That reduces maybe 6 ounces right away. Then there's the next stage, and this is more advanced. These are tarps, and there are all kinds of different tarps. They're shaped tarps that you're seeing here, and they're flat tarps. These tend to be very lightweight, and you don't have to buy these fancy materials or anything. You can make these out of Tyvek. Excellent ventilation, no condensation. Very compact. This is my tarp. Some sleeping bag options. 2 things I want to mention here. One is you can use a sleeping bag, but we have some examples here of quilts like you use at home. It's just like a sleeping bag, except it has no back. Quilts are an interesting option because they mean you can get the same top layer insulation and side layer insulation without carrying that extra weight. And actually that can shave almost a pound off the sleeping bag. Quilts tend to have air baffles down the side, and that they actually tend to secure either to your sleeping pad or behind you with snaps. So it retains all that air above you, and then you're lying on a sleeping pad. It's important to lie on a sleeping pad because that's providing the warmth. Just to give you an example of some of the weight temperature options. Again, this is trip planning. Comes down to trip planning. What are the temperatures that you're going to expect on a trip? And that will dictate what gear you bring. So synthetic mummy, 20 degree from Kelty is like 3 pounds, 2 ounces. It's bulky. If you go to a 40 degree, again, synthetic, just under 2 pounds. So just that 20 degrees can make a big difference. 600 down fill versus 800. Under 2 pounds, really, really lightweight. You can actually take it down below 20. If you go to a quilt, you can take it down even further. Finally, just to talk about backpacks, factors affecting the weight, certainly the capacity. That's why I was talking about compactness of gear. If your gear takes up less space, you need a smaller capacity pack. Smaller packs mean less weight. Whether it has a frame or it's frameless, what's interesting is when you get a lighter pack, you don't need a frame. Other factors affecting weight, whether it's a heavyweight fabric or a lighter weight fabric. Hip belts, those giant hip belts, again, you have that giant hip belt because you have so much pressure on your hips. Padding, pockets, straps, lighter and more compressive your gear, less capacity, less structure, less padding, less need for the heavy-duty fabrics. So in some ways, you're penalizing yourself by carrying heavier gear. We have an external aluminum frame. What you take is dependent on the trip you're going on. Advantages: high weight capacity, attachment points, great back ventilation, heavy-duty fabric. They tend to be less expensive. Disadvantages that they tend to be a bit heavy. Internal frames, they're made out of metal or they're made out of some sort of fiberglass. They actually are pretty good for scrambling. They're good for carrying heavy loads. A lot of them have pretty stiff frames. They can be more comfortable than external packs. They have large internal storage. Some advantages. Depending on the one you get, they might have a little less back ventilation and fewer external attachment points. Then the final kind is a frameless pack. You don't really need the frame because you're carrying a lighter pack. Advantages: the pack itself is very lightweight. Less back ventilation, but you don't necessarily need the back ventilation because you're not sweating as much, because you're not carrying as much. Less weight capacity, less content capacity. It's an evolutionary process. It's got some good things, some bad things. I tend to find them extremely comfortable. This was the big 3 I took last year on the AT. It's a big 2-person tarp I took. I was on the trail for 13 days. I used it once, which is an interesting thing. If you hike on the Appalachian Trail or trails that have a lot of shelters, you might just bring a tarp just in case you need to camp out. So it's kind of like a hedge just in case I need it. I used my ultralight. There were a couple nights I was cold, so I just put on a thermal jacket underneath and I was warm. And then I used a Gorilla, which is a smaller capacity Gossamer gear pack. And just a couple of photos just to give you a sense. So this is a tarp with trekking poles. That's actually a bivy sack right here. I was just cooking right here in front of the tarp, and that's all the kit I had. You can camp, leave no trace. You have a very light footprint, and you're gone the next day. And this is a 6-moon lunar solo. It's a single person tent. I carry these wood screws that I screw into the wooden platforms and to pitch on them. I'm using different conditions, different types of shelters. Here's me in a hammock, and what I'm using here is an insulation system. It's actually a quilt that hangs underneath the hammock. It's a down quilt. Literally just found 2 trees on the side of it, near a pond, and set it up and go. This is a pyramid. It's actually a 2-person pyramid. And you see that piece of plastic underneath? The ground in Scotland tends to be very boggy, so I just carried a piece of plastic with me. And again, you just can pitch it pretty much anywhere. You can even hang it from a tree and pitch it that way. Different climates, different kinds of gear. Obviously, if you want to keep your costs down, you're going to probably standardize on different things. And if you want to use this presentation, it'll be up on the web. And if you want to show it to anybody, or you want to modify it, or you want to use it for commercial purposes, you can do that. Thank you very much.